Welcome to our presentations on what is social justice, the social justice movement. We're up to lesson 4, and lesson 3, when we had covered some of the first terms, were actually what is social justice, where we talked about the term itself, what does it mean, and then we had finished up the last lesson talking about whiteness, and what does that mean. And so this week's lesson is really all about following up with that whiteness, unpacking it. What are the different terms for whiteness that we see that are being used? And so the first one we'll be looking at is called white privilege. It's a series of unearned advantages that accrue to white people by virtue of their whiteness. And so it's a completely racial idea that white people gain in a particular way in which others do not. And then a second description is beliefs, behaviors, or systems which perpetuate white privilege. And so there we have, again, that sort of the idea of what that is. And the key word in there is systems. We've heard that over and over again, is these systems or sort of organizations that sort of perpetuate this. And so we have to sort of see what that is. And so this is what whiteness allegedly established. Again, we had finished last lesson talking about whiteness and what it was, and now whiteness really is about setting up a power thing or a power that sort of establishes whiteness over top of everything else, that sort of builds by taking advantage of others, is sort of the idea of it. And so the claim is made that it is all whites who are born with and have this unique privilege. Now, it doesn't take into account the idea that there's a lot of differences within white populations to begin with. There's various white populations scattered throughout the world who are not either European or American, and so you have to sort of figure out what that means. Also, what about skin tones? I used to joke with a guy at the prison. I was Native American, and in the summer, when I'd work out on the yard and do all sorts of things, I would get darker than him. And so I would kid him. I put my arm up next to him and told him I was more Native than what he was. And so we had sort of an ongoing joke with some of that. But so you see, skin color has a lot of differences. And even Europeans, Northern Europeans are whiter often there than those who come from around the Mediterranean and so forth. And even if you jump to the other side, the south side of the Mediterranean, a lot of those could actually fit quite well within white-toned populations, and nobody would know much different, you know. And so you have to sort of understand there's a lot of differences, and so it's really sort of an unfair thing to try pack it into just this one term. And the claim says that privilege is in every part of our culture, and that all whites have benefited from this built-in privilege. So simply by having this, you automatically receive benefits from it. Now again, what do you do with light-skinned people who aren't necessarily directly European? How do you understand that? And so again, there's things that should be easy to sort of overthrow this idea, but it's really the idea is if you have white skin, you've automatically gained where others have lost. And that's a big part of it also. Because this next one is white privilege makes every white person guilty because in some way they have benefited from this privilege through the oppression of others. And so that's sort of the two sides of it. It's not simply that whites have benefited or done better in one category or another. It's the idea that they could only have accomplished that because they've held other people down. They've only gained because they've hurt other people in some way. Now, if you really look economically around the world, you find that the opposite is true. That oftentimes in these countries connecting with the United States, their economies go up. We may be getting goods or services from them, but they benefit in some way. And so we have to see that this is really a sort of a nasty way of looking at things. And again, you're automatically guilty. And so again, we know people who come from different nationalities, and I'm not quite sure how they blend that in, because what do you do with whiteness then? And so the idea of white privilege is not that it is necessarily provable, but that it is simply assumed by those who believe it is true. And so what they'll oftentimes do is they'll look at some statistics about equity issues, about how there's differences between maybe one group or another, and they'll say, see, this proves that white privilege exists, without ever looking at what other things might have contributed to it or caused it. And so they really look away from everything else and simply say, everything must be because you're white. You're white, and therefore you've gained in one way or another. And again, they wouldn't look at other evidences. The only answer that they ever have or ever want is it has to be racism. It has to be white privilege that's causing this. And again, they would also reject the idea of saying, well, you know, actually 1/3 of this group does better than the 2/3 of the same group. So how do you understand those things? Because oftentimes within those differences, there's larger differences between the whole white population from top to bottom and the whole black population top to bottom and the whole Hispanic population top to bottom and the whole Asian population top to bottom. And so they conflate things and don't always make a lot of sense. And so this idea ignores every aspect of culture that might benefit non-whites in any way. We have a love for sports in this land. The average salary of an NBA player is $10 million a year. I've heard anywhere numbers 70 to 80% of them are African American. And that wouldn't even be so bad, but my question would be, why aren't there also a lot of short Hispanics? Why aren't they allowed to play in the NBA? Why don't we seek equity with this? I can really only remember one, maybe two Asians that have played. They had the center in Houston, and then they had another guy, I can't remember his name, but yeah, and so isn't that unfair also? And so how do you start breaking those things down? And some of those numbers remain true also into football. The margin is not quite as large, but baseball also. And baseball isn't even always the idea of African Americans in the U.S. A lot of the baseball players actually come from the Caribbean and Central America, and so how do you figure those things in? Now we're bringing people from outside, and so how do we fit all of that? And so this idea really ignores all of that. They just want to simplify it and say it's all race, period, without looking at all the different factors and even all the different realities that are to be found. And this makes many of the perceived advantages or even the disadvantages in our culture only about the color of one's skin. Now, to me, that is racist. The very thing they claim everybody else does, that is what they're doing. And so they actually have a term for that. It's called projection. It's a projection when you accuse your opponent of what you yourself are guilty of. And you see that in all sorts of different things. Maybe you've even had personal battles with people, and they start accusing you of the things that you know that they're up to. And so that's part of what it is. And if you look at some of their policies and some of their thoughts, they are oftentimes very racist. Oftentimes the liberal policies are built on the premise that minorities, particularly African Americans, can't do well unless you give them a hand. Unless you change the rules for them somehow, they'll never get ahead. Well, that's a racist thought. It's a racist thought to think that this group can't achieve simply because we're here or they don't have the abilities or something like that. And so they dump on us what they're really guilty of themselves. And then white privilege denies the fact that in every culture there are benefits to being a part of that culture. And so they apply this only to the United States, this idea of white privilege. But my guess would be you'd have great benefits if you moved to China, if you could be a part of their culture. First, learning their language, figuring out what some of their customs are, figuring out how the system works and how to understand how the people interact with one another. Those would all be important things. So I wouldn't be able to move to China and say, well, I'm a poor white guy from the U.S. Now you guys are all racist because I don't fit into your culture. They would look at me and say, go back to America, you're an idiot, go away, leave us alone. The same thing would happen in Japan. Japan is a very closed society for the most part. So if I went to Japan, the likelihood that I would fit in ever would be pretty slim. And then even if you do get in the culture a little bit with Japan, you're still almost always on the outside. So now, is that something that's racist, or is that simply just part of their culture? And I'd say it's a big part of their culture. So should we throw all of the same stuff they throw at white privilege upon those groups? And you can find that in every country. Go to a Muslim land. If you don't fit into Muslim culture, if you're a Christian, you're automatically a second-class citizen with very limited opportunities. Just go through the Northern Africa or through the Middle East. Christians at best are second-class citizens. Some are worse than that. And so culture is a big deal. So to say it's all about race is nonsensical, because in the Muslim lands, most of those, it's not about race at all. It's strictly about religion, because the race is common in that sense.
Like in Africa, genocides happen between groups of people that we wouldn't, visually we would say there's no difference.
Yep. Part of what goes on in Nigeria right now, right? Northern Nigeria, the Muslims attack and kill the Christians. They burn their villages. They steal their children. That was part of the Boko Haram, I think it was called, that where they stole all the girls from that school. And so those things happen all the time. Now, how would they explain those things? And so, again, you get beyond our American context, and all of this would fall apart very quickly. And then white privilege denies God's providential care as he gives to each person as he sees fit and for his own purposes. So here, a part of this is God's blessing. God blesses people differently. Jesus even has the parable about the servants, where the one gets 10 talents, the other gets 5 talents, and the other gets 1 talent. The picture in Scripture is that God lifts up and God tears down. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away, Job said, right? And so we have to understand that to do all of this is to deny God's part in the distribution of his blessings. And so as a Christian, this becomes really offensive because it takes God completely out of the picture. But again, as we talked earlier, all of this with its Marxist foundation doesn't believe in God anyway. And so that's part of how that's played out. And ultimately, then, the charge of inequity is pointed at God, who is the source of all good things. And a clear text of that is James 1:17. Every good and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Now, the idea then is God sorts this out. Even in the gifts within the church in Corinthians, the picture is that the Spirit gives as he wills. Not everybody has the same gifts or abilities. There's distinctions within Scripture, and that is always seen as from God's hand in one way or another. Now, our good gifts, when we give them, are not ever simply for ourselves. Our gifts are always to be a blessing and a benefit also to others. So within the church, God gifts you and bless you, and you use that to help the church. Financially, every year, churches and Christians particularly give billions and billions of dollars to good causes. Helping the homeless, helping the unwed mothers, all sorts of different causes that even we as a church give to. And so the idea is that as God has blessed us, we are to also bless others. And we would hold to that. But we wouldn't buy into the idea of white privilege. We wouldn't say that that's the motivation. We do this because God calls us to, because Christ calls us to live that way. And so this is one of my pet peeves, that white Christians who complain about what they have are really being ungrateful to God. We live in an area that sometimes we hear people say, well, we've received all this white privilege, and they neglect to acknowledge what their parents have done. They don't acknowledge what their grandparents have done, what their great-grandparents have done, oftentimes suffering. South Dakota, rural poverty was a very real thing for very many years. And you still find pockets of it within small towns. Part of the reason sometimes people move to the small rural towns is simply because of the cost of living. You can buy a house at half the price or a third of the price that you can in Sioux Falls or Sioux City or Yankton or Mitchell or something like that. And so there you have the idea that how do you do that? And so you're ungrateful to what God has given. You're ungrateful for the blessings God has given to your parents and grandparents. And oftentimes, again, they had a great cost. The first immigrants that came into southeast South Dakota did not have an easy time of it. Some people look at these pictures and they sort of ooh and ah over these sod houses. Well, the wind is howling, it's icy and snowy. I don't think I'd want to live in a sod house. I wouldn't have to walk no matter how cold how far it was to go milk the cow or something like that. And oftentimes the first two generations died young. They didn't last that long because farming was hard work and all those things. And so there are great issues with that we have to be aware of. And so to just say, well, what I have is because of white privilege is an insult to God and it's insult to those who have gone before you. And then in a way, white privilege is denying the suffering and hurt that is common to all of humanity, including all white people. How many of us know of anybody who's never suffered anything? Maybe it was bullying in school. Maybe it was rejection. Maybe it was betrayal by somebody. Maybe it's been health problems since you were young. Who knows what it could be, but everybody I know has suffered. And as a pastor, you get to see these things sort of up close and personal. And so you'll meet people who will say, from the outside, you'd say, oh, they've got everything. And then you start to visit with them. And then you find out, well, 30 years ago, they had to bury their first spouse. And they talk about how hard the kids had it. Or they had to bury a child. And they tell how difficult that was. And so I can remember my family talking about one of my uncles who got killed in World War II. And from the Sunday that my grandma was notified, they say she was never the same. So there's real hurt, there's real sorrow, there's real difficulty. And so white privilege denies that. It says our suffering is worse than everybody else's suffering. And so white privilege chooses some suffering and makes it worse than other suffering, even when there is no real way to compare one to another. And so they'll look and say, well, see how difficult an African-American male has in this particular neighborhood. Well, you could also find in other neighborhoods where they also had it difficult. When Diane and I worked at the prison, we had one guy who came out of Los Angeles. And he was talking about already when he was growing up about the pressure to be part of gangs. And you had to be part of gangs because there were other gangs that were going to get you, and especially if you're a white kid. And so it was dangerous for him to be a white kid in that neighborhood, not to be affiliated with a gang. And sorry to say, then the gangs also led to the drugs and life of prison and all the other stuff. But again, how do you say, well, his doesn't count compared to somebody else's being, oh, well, that gets him off the hook for everything. And so it denies those things, even again when there's no real comparison. Or even if you've had difficulties growing up, how many of us don't know white kids who have had that? Maybe they've been autistic. Maybe they've never been quite fit in their class. Maybe they're Christian amongst a non-Christian group. There's all sorts of things that can cause real suffering that we have to be aware of. And white privilege ignores the real reason for human suffering, which is human sinfulness. See, this is the bottom line that covers it all. It's not the color of one's skin. You can find bigots within every color of skin. No matter how we look, how tall, how short, you can find bigots amongst us all. That's just a reality. But that has to do with sinfulness. And so the issue isn't how do we change people's skin or how do we get to get this idea of racism, but how do we fix the human heart? And so if you don't acknowledge this, you'll never get to the core root of the problem and you'll never have a way to overcome it. And as Christians, we say we can deal with all of these things in a way through the gospel. And you can't overcome the sinfulness without the gospel. And we understand there will always be a battle with sinfulness, but the gospel is what helps us to see the best way. It guides us and directs us and really helps us to see what's important. Okay, the next term is white supremacy. The definition I have is any belief, behavior, or system that supports or enhances white privilege. Now we have to understand one of the things that social justice has done is that it redefines words. And this is one that they've really redefined. And so our first idea of white supremacy be somebody with a hood someplace, right? A white hood. Down south somewhere, maybe, that's sort of the... Or somebody who's a skinhead and got a big swastika tattooed to the side of his head. That would be our idea of white supremacist.
This is so frustrating because I'm looking at white supremacy, which they've redefined, and within the definition they're using white privilege, which doesn't exist, at least in the way that they say.
Claim, yeah.
So you've got so much confusion that when you're uninformed, it works for their cause.
It does. Keeps people off guard. And as long as you're able to be in a position where you can attack people, you can get them to submit quite quickly. If you can start throwing racist accusations, because that's sort of seen as the sin of all sins right now. If you can change the words to declare somebody's a racist, you can get them to shut up. You can get them to all of a sudden give in and admit to all sorts of stuff, whether they've done anything or not, because they're fearful of what you're going to do. And again, the idea that you brought up the white privilege, seeing it doesn't exist, as some people say. One of the funny things that they had recently was Ibram Kendi, who had sent out a text talking, and he had pointed out how white kids are starting to send into colleges on their entrance stuff saying that they're minorities. And oftentimes they'll say they're part Native American or something like that because it's hard to tell and so forth. And so the idea then is, well, it's easier to get into colleges if you can claim a minority. And so he sent that out to say, see what all these awful white kids are doing. And he missed the whole point that they were doing it because it's at an advantage to be a minority to get into colleges. And so he sort of shot himself in the foot, and I don't know if he texted much after that, but anyway, he sure backtracked and hid from that one quick, because he sort of proved that his point was all wrong, that the privilege wasn't there because it was actually helping the minorities and not others. Okay, now back to white supremacy. Note this is not about one's personal feelings, but instead about systems that allegedly oppress non-whites to the benefit of whites. And so that's really the idea. They've changed the terminology, and so now it's not you as an individual. They don't really care what you as an individual say, think, have done, or not done. This is all about the idea saying that you're part of the system. You're the problem in that way. And so individual whites here do not have to do anything or hate anyone to be guilty of this. And so it is absolutely shameful when Christians admit guilt to what they don't have, what they haven't done. And then they admit that guilt not to God, but to other people. And so it's a shameful thing for them to do that, to say, oh yeah, I must be guilty, even if they have not done anything. That's supporting a lie. And we're not supposed to lie, and we're not supposed to support lies.
But people that I think there's probably two different categories of people that admit to it. Some that are just kind of confused, but I think some they do it to their advantage. Because when you within some groups, if you agree that you're white privilege and you're part of the white supremacy, and then the next job is to lament it, they get power.
Yep. Yeah.
So there is no real.
And in that, I really question whether they feel the guilt or not. What I oftentimes think is these are people who are left or liberal leaning in the first place. And the guilt they're acknowledging is not their own guilt. They're acknowledging the guilt that they think other white people have. Those awful conservatives, those awful Trump supporters, those awful Christians, whatever it might be, they're guilty. And so when they lament the guilt, they're not lamenting what their own sense of guilt. They're saying, oh yeah, my people. So they're, and so it's a whole distorted thing because they have no right to repent for me in the first place. It's my job to repent for the things I've done. It's not their right to repent or lament about what I may or may not have done. So whites do not need to be part of or support Nazi groups or the KKK to be guilty. And so a lot of people don't understand this. When you're talking about being confused, a lot of people, whites would still think white supremacy, oh yeah, that's them Nazis. When the social justice people talk about it, they're talking about every white person. So if you're a moderate political person, moderate in your Christian views and stuff like that, you are one of these white supremacists. That's who they claim you are. And so if you're a mom who sits at home and thinks you got it together and you're teaching your kids right, you are a white supremacist under this category. And there's no way to get out of it. And if you are white, you're guilty of this because the color of your skin. It's simple racism. This whole thing is racism. It's hating one group of one color simply because of the color that they have. And then they, half the stuff they make up just to be able to say, well, see how awful they are. And again, oftentimes it's projection. But if you really look at who's done what, which side has started the KKK, which side stood up for slavery, which side has stood up for the abortion of poor whites and minorities, which side has done all these awful things, which side has not taught children in these major cities, which one does policies that keep people stuck in sort of the ghettos in these cities. Who's run all of those cities? It hasn't been conservative white folk. And so you have to sort of say, well, for them to fail at this for so long, who's the racist? Who's really doing what? And that's how we have to see this. And so white supremacy is now seen to have infected every part of our culture so much that we cannot get away from it. And so the only solution is to tear everything down and start over. And that's a recurring theme through the social justice. It's also broken. It's also almost like the idea of it's a cancer. So you have a cancer in your arm. You have no choice just to chop it off. That's all that's left. And that's their idea. Let's just get rid of this altogether. And so they see no other option. So they don't want to fix anything. That's why they don't really look at policies that work. That's why the cities haven't been fixed. They don't want them fixed. They want them broken because they gain political power from the brokenness. And so we have to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so white supremacy now claims that much of what biblical Christians would consider good and of value socially is actually part of a racist system that is designed to oppress non-whites. And this is where you really get into the insane part of it, where they start to say, well, the good things in society are bad because somehow they hurt the minorities. Instead of saying, let's all use the good things in society and lift everybody up, it's no, let's get rid of them. And when you get rid of them, what happens? Everything falls apart. You don't improve it. You don't help it. It all gets worse. And so now what you're starting to hear, and this even from some, again, those who claim to be moderate Christians are starting to say some of these things too. Under white supremacy, things like getting a good education, keeping families together, having a good work ethic, or having ordered communities are now seen as Christian national idols. Instead of saying, no, these are biblical foundational principles on how to raise a family, how to keep a good culture, how to develop a society, now they've said, these are idols. You're worshiping these things. We're saying, no. We're trying to live out Scripture. That's our goal. That's our purpose. And yet they want to tear them all down. Because what would happen if they had good education? What would happen in the inner cities if you got rid of the teachers' union and had good education? Or you gave to each family in the inner city vouchers where they could go pick their form of education. It would lift everybody up. So why do they fight against it when it happens? They want to suppress them. They had a wonderful voucher program in Washington, D.C. that Obama helped shut down. Well, where's the love for the brother? What about those kids now who are stuck in those useless Washington education systems? You know, quite a while back, I read in the Detroit system, most of the kids, by the time they're seniors in high school, can't read or write properly or do math. They're failing, and yet they say, oh, you're the awful ones. No, they're the awful ones because they're failing to do what they're called to do. And then what about keeping families together? The largest indicator for poverty in this land is single parents. Single parent families. Moms with 3 or 4 kids and no dad around. You want to find poverty? That's where you find it. And so, shouldn't we work to put families together instead of tear them apart? Wouldn't that help everybody? So that's not an idol, that's just common sense. Having a good work ethic. What built the United States was the Protestant work ethic. It was not black slavery. It was people who came here and worked. They knew how to work, they left Europe, they had an opportunity to suddenly get away from the class system, the feudal type systems that were in Europe, and they had an opportunity to earn stuff for themselves and their families and to keep it. And they worked hard for it. Your grandparents and your great-grandparents worked hard for this. And so to now say it's all because you've abused somebody is just nonsense. Okay, the next term is white complicity. This is the idea that white people, through the practices of whiteness, and by benefiting from white privilege, contribute to the maintenance of the systematic racial injustice. And so there the idea is, again, you're guilty. If you're white, you're complicit in the game. Whether you've done anything or not, whether you've done things to help other people. You know, what do they do with like Diane and I who went and worked at the prison? You know, we're 20% or better of our attendees at church were Native American. We had a nice group of Hispanics, African Americans. Are we white complicit? Or were we seeking to preach the gospel to whoever would listen? Regardless of color. I'm a big believer in Revelations 5:9, where some from every nation, tongue, tribe, and family group. Everybody. And so the idea that just because you're white, you're complicit in this is nonsensical. But under this, every white person is guilty of racism simply for being white and for their not standing against what social justice seems as racism. So, first of all, you're guilty simply because of your color. And there's no way to get out of that. You know, maybe that's why the Democrats are all caught with all these pictures where they blackface themselves at one point or another. I haven't seen any Republicans who have done that. It's, you know, so you have to just sort of wonder those things. But then the other thing is, if you don't do what they want you to do, you're guilty. So it's not simply your color, you also have to agree with them politically and religiously. And if you don't, then you're guilty.
It just seems like if this was a game, it's rigged. You cannot win.
Can't win.
And if you ever point out, hey, this is rigged, then you're the worst person ever.
Yep. Yep.
You're the biggest loser.
We're coming up to some of that. Yeah. Yeah, that's what it is. This is all designed to just shut everybody up. This is saying if you're a white person, if you got white blood, whatever that might be, you just have to sit down and shut up, and we have the right to do all the talking. We're going to do it our way, and you just have to get out of our way. And you have to give us all your stuff. But that's...
Sign me up.
Yeah. So white complicity claims white people will remain guilty until they accept and then confess their guilt of racism and white privilege to non-whites. And again, we had seen churches going out and white churches going out and bowing down before minorities to confess their guilt. They're to do that to God. And those that they were confessing their guilt to need to also be confessing their own guilt to God. Our sins, first and foremost, start with God. That's where we have to work with. And that's sort of our focus, too, is you have to start with the gospel. But again, there's no getting around this. Like you said, the game is rigged to start with. And so, but what is actually found is that there really is no forgiveness because white people will always be white and therefore guilty. So as we'll see coming up, is you might have partial forgiveness, but you're still white. And there's no grace. And those are awful things to be under. And so then after you've confessed your racial sins, you have to confess for your ancestors too. And then your ancestors don't even have to be your ancestors. If some white guy did something a long time ago, no matter whether he's from, you're guilty for that. Well, that's not biblical in the least little sense.
You know, the more I look at this, the more I'm convinced that this is just Marxism dressed up in a way that it makes it easier for people that aren't paying attention to get to accept it all. Yeah. But where it says repent for the sins of your ancestors, that's the big key right there, because that's getting rid of the Constitution eventually.
Christianity,
and then, you know, taking that plate and just swiping it clean.
Yep.
And starting with something new, which they know what they want.
Yeah. And that's what we looked at with our first two lessons, was the idea that Marxism wants to tear everything down because that somehow they think it's just going to automatically grow up and it'll be all different. So you get rid of everything that exists that oftentimes Christians would say this is good and beneficial. They said, oh no, you got to get rid of it all. And then they have somehow that it's going to just restart by itself. Well, in the world. So what happens when you take your crop out and if you just left it that way? What would you have corn and soybeans all over the place the next year, or would you have weeds here and then weeds there, and the next year would be more weeds, eventually there'd be no beans and no corn. You'd have big fields of weeds that were useless. That's really what Marxism does. It gets rid of the beans and the corn and produces crops of weeds that are worthless and dangerous. And so that's how you have to understand, because God's put us here to do these things responsibly, and Marxism does just the opposite. And so after you confess your sins, then you'll have to deal with other people's sins. Okay, the next term is white equilibrium. This is the belief, the system that allows white people to remain comfortably ignorant. And I think this is sort of what John was saying is people want to be here somewhat. There's somewhat of a reality. But the idea that they're mean and nasty because it is wrong. They do this and they give in because they want to remain comfortable. Because as soon as you object, then you're attacked from all sorts of different directions. It's the advantage of not being on social media. If they don't like me, I don't have to have to see it. You know, so you have a benefit with that, right? And then another description is occupying a position of privilege, which allows a person to avoid having to deal with or to even understand the experience of oppression and marginalization, and indeed bigotries like racism or even the concept of race itself. But again, bigotries are found everywhere. There was even bigotries between Europeans and Europeans. When we lived in the inner city, we found out there's bigotries between African Americans and African Americans. Depends where they come from, and sometimes it's a matter of how dark one's skin is. There's bigotries between light-skinned African Americans and dark-skinned African Americans. You have that within the Hispanic populations. You know, I've heard one time that you want to go find bigotries, go to Mexico, where you find you have different groups. You have your Spanish group, you have your Hispanic group, which is the mix, and you have sort of most of who would be the peasants, those who were the original sort of Native Americans down there. And there's a lot of bigotries between those. And so what do you do with those things? And so white equilibrium claims that discussions about race, reparations, and inequity are avoided so white people will not have their reality disrupted. Might you have another reason or two for not having these discussions? For one thing, if you could bring in facts or details, they won't listen to you. Another thing, how do you like dealing with people who are making false accusations against you? Yeah, so there's lots of reasons besides white equilibrium that you might not want those conversations. Or maybe you don't like the intensity of the fight. Because sometimes, just look at what they did in Portland and Minneapolis and this up-in-your-face type of stuff. People don't like that. And so maybe that's why they want to avoid this. They don't want the nonsense. They want to make a living, they want to raise their family, and they want life to go on. And so the assumption is that it is avoided so that whites do not need to face their guilt. Again, guilt is assumed. It's not whether you've done anything, it's the color of your skin. If you're white, you're guilty, period. And for what they owe as individuals because of what they have unjustly gained through the oppression of non-whites. And again, so the concept is that you've only gained because whites have oppressed others. Takes away from all the hard work that your parents and grandparents and great-grandparents have done. It sort of spits on their graves in a way, saying, well, all of this comes from someplace else. And my challenge to the liberals who want to follow that nonsense is, then give all your stuff away. Find the first minority and just hand them the keys and say, I'm going back to Europe. It's nonsense. If you're going to be white and assume these things, then just give up your stuff. Don't take my stuff away. You just give up your stuff. And once you've given up all your stuff and gone back to Europe, then maybe I'll think about it. Until you do and follow up your beliefs, I'm not going to believe that you really believe it. You're just saying those things because you don't want people to pick on you. Because you want to be a big shot. You want to have people slap you on the back and say, oh yeah, he's a good white guy. He's a good white guy. And that's what I think we see in a lot of the Protestant churches right now in evangelicalism. Is we got a lot of white preachers who just want to get slapped on the back and say, oh, you're a good white guy. That's what they're doing. They're not dealing with the issues. They're just caving into all of it. And then the next term is white fragility. This is the inability and unwillingness of white people to talk about race due to the grip that whiteness, white supremacy, white privilege, white complicity, and white equilibrium exert on them. That's a lot of words. Anyway. But again, it's a nonsensical thing. White fragility is seen as a posture of defensiveness, anxiety, and anger that is exhibited by whites in response to discussions of race and their guilt. So if somebody comes up to you and says, you're guilty, somebody shows up on your farm and says, you stole all my cows, and they're in your face, and they're poking you in the chest, aren't you going to get a little defensive? Aren't you going to get a little anxious with a lot of false charges? And then you're going to call 911 and say, Sheriff, get this knothead off my yard before he does some damage and hurts either me or something, or my family or something on my property. But that's the idea. So they aggressively attack you, call you names, do all sorts of stuff, and then expect that you're going to just cower down and say, oh yeah, you're right. But a lot of white people do.
That right there is like one of the great examples of the rigged game.
Yep.
Right? When you're to the point where you're going to defend yourself, it's proof that you're guilty
Yep.
of what they're accusing you of, which isn't true.
Yep. Yeah. 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 And you see this not only in this type of stuff, you see this in a lot of different things with conservatism, is as soon as you speak up, then they say, oh, see, that shows that you're insensitive, you're cruel, you're mean-hearted, whatever it might be. And so white fragility claims that if you deny your guilt in the matters of race, that it only proves that you're guilty of what they claim. And that's a nasty position to be in. Because how do you respond to that? If there's no way to get around it, what do you do with it? And so here's where you wanted to get, John. Damned if you do, damned if you don't. It's a rigged game. It's set up in a way that white people, you have no choice. It's just the facts. Deal with it. That's where it's at. And that's, again, you can't get around that. But if that's a situation, why would you enter into a conversation about it? As a white person, there's no talking to anybody if that's their view to begin with. You can't reason with them. They don't like facts and details and logic anyway. So how do you do that? You have to walk away. And then again, of course, then it proves you're guilty. So the best thing is to simply ignore it and not accept their guilt. Don't accept their accusations. Don't accept their reason, their thoughts, whatever. Doesn't apply to me. It might apply to you. That if it's subjective, it applies to the one who's saying it. But your subjectivity doesn't apply to me. You know, you can believe anything you want, but that doesn't mean I have to believe any of it or accept any of it. And that's where we as Christians have to be. When the world throws nonsense upon us, let us call it nonsense and walk away. When the world tells you that boys can be girls and girls can be boys and defy science, even though they claim to be scientific, what else do? You just have to walk away. Yeah. Well, I would say you strengthen other people and tell the in-betweeners who don't understand it or haven't put a lot of thought into it, try to share that and lift them up. But you don't engage people like that because that's a lost argument. They're going to take whatever you say and twist it anyway, and just to make you look bad. And then white fragility claims that the only proper way white people can respond is to acknowledge racism, admit their part in it, repent of it to non-whites, and then work against what they claim is racism. It's accept total defeat or you're guilty. But as we saw before, you're guilty anyway, right?
I was just going to say you're guilty anyway. So
why accept defeat? And that's not a Christian way to do it. We don't acknowledge sins that we haven't committed. That's accepting a lie. We don't admit our part in it if we've done nothing. And if somebody says, well, there's this huge system that does all of that, make them prove it. Don't just say, oh, well, yeah, could be. Because for every time you find a minority that can get hurt in something, you'll find whites who can get hurt in something. Well, people get murdered on this side, people get murdered on that side. And the truth of the matter is, if you look at the FBI, the Department of Justice's own stats, the bulk of the people killed that are white get killed by white people. The bulk of people that are black that get killed are killed by black people. And the same thing is true for Hispanics. And so how do you begin to make sense of that? The problems, again, for the most part, aren't from one group to another group. It's within the groups. How many of the 500 plus people who have been murdered in Chicago were a black killing another black? Or a Hispanic killing another Hispanic? Or even a white killing another white? The bulk of it is not interracial, as they understand race. And so again, you can come and throw statistics at them, but for the most part, they reject the statistics to begin with. And they'll seek to tear them down. And so then we have to try reason with social justice or try to explain the problems non-whites face apart from it being racism, only leave you in your guilt. Again, it's the damned if you do, damned if you don't. And so at a certain point, you have to say, why would I have this discussion with you at all? If you come from that perspective to begin with, you're not searching for the truth. You're not seeking out right and wrong. You're not seeking to fix anything. You're seeking to divide. You're seeking to conquer. It's all about power. And that's where we started in our first lesson. That's what this is all about. This isn't about helping poor people. It's not about helping minorities. All of those things are and could be done. A lot of the things that are being done, if they would just get some of the liberals out of the way, they'd be done in a lot better way. Like education. Place to start in the inner cities is to fix those schools, and the only way to do that is get rid of white liberals who are holding them back. Let them have their vouchers so they can pick the school that they want. That would transform the education in those places. And there's many other things you could do. You shut down the border. Stop the fentanyl and the cocaine and everything else that's floating up there that destroy minority neighborhoods. There's way to fix these things. Stop bringing in all illegals to do all sorts of different work and undercut the working poor. Because when you bring in people who will work for $10 an hour and you don't have to pay any benefits to, you've just destroyed the ones who need $15 an hour with benefits to survive. Because that's who it's competing with. So the people who bring them over only hurt the other minorities. And I think they know they do. They don't care. Because it's a power game. And again, the best way is to restore families in the inner city. You want to fix it? You want to get rid of poverty? It's the first place to start, is to try to keep people together in marriage with kids. It's foundational. It's the leading statistic for poverty. It's not what color. Because if you're white and a single mom with 3 or 4 kids, you're probably in poverty or at the poverty line too. Same thing in the Hispanic community. It's just the reality.
You know, I think if let's say, someone on the more progressive side were to say, yeah, we agree that broken up families isn't good, then they automatically get attacked by feminism.
Yep.
Because it's saying a woman can't
Yep.
do this all on her own.
Yeah.
So they've kind of, trapped themselves. They can't win either.
Yeah. And that they really bring upon themselves. When you come up with stupid ideas and defend stupid ideas, you're gonna have problems. You know, that's the same thing with women's sports. You know, so they had Title IX that established women's sports, and so now you have the transgender swimmer at Penn University of Penn, who demolished the women, beat them by what, like 30 seconds or 38 seconds, and watch one match with a lady and a guy in an MMA fight. Those are violent to begin with, and you really want to see violence. And so you're going to promote guys beating the tar out of women? And so they can't say anything, so they force the women swimmers to shut up and take second, third, and fourth place. Be happy with your silver because this guy deserves it because he thinks he's a lady today. When last year he was swimming on the men's team. And so they turn themselves into knots because they do dumb things. And then they blame us for all the problems. Or they say, no, see this problem, now we have to fix it. Instead of people saying, well, we only have this problem because you caused it, and they still keep voting the same people in. You know, if the people in Chicago haven't learned by now, there's a guy who had a car place, and they broke in, and he had a huge display of expensive watches, and they what are the expensive watches? Rolexes. And he was a Rolls-Royce dealer. And so he had this expensive display worth a couple million, and they did a smash and grab. They came in and stole a couple $1 million worth of watches. And he thought, well, you live in Chicago, what do you expect? This is probably what you voted for all this time. You're probably paying somebody under the table contributing to the cause. I don't care. When bad things happen to you because you do awful things and dumb things, then don't expect me to pay the price. And that's how I feel about places like Chicago, Detroit, elsewhere. You made the mess, you fix it. But they never do. And they never vote the people out. You know, even they talk about voting fraud. I can remember already when I was a kid, that they talked about the only way that Kennedy beat Nixon was the voting fraud in Chicago. So that's it's 60 years ago. And already then it was, there's more dead people who vote in Chicago than live people. It was all controlled by the unions, all controlled by the Democrat Party. The machine, remember, that was the whole idea. And so, if that's what they want to do, now they talk about what a cesspool San Francisco is becoming. That's what you get. You want this social justice idiocy. You want to let criminals out without any penalty. Don't be surprised when you lock them up one day and the next day they're stealing your car. And when it happens, I don't care. That's what you want to promote. You want to promote sin. That's the consequences of sin. Don't complain to me when you do it. But leave your sin in San Francisco. Don't spread it anywhere else. Okay. To the various issues non-whites might face, the only acceptable cause or reason to the societal or economic inequities is racism. See, so you can't even have any discussion because that's the only answer they'll accept. So you can't talk about single parents. You can't talk about bad schools because it's in bad cities run by bad governments, because they are those bad governments. They are the ones who are hurting the minorities. For all their attacks on white, it's them who's doing it. And I think even Malcolm X had talked about the most dangerous people to the black population was white liberals. You can find it online. There's a great quote by him about white liberals. He could see it. And I believe also that I read it was shortly thereafter he said that he was killed. Now, if I was a conspiracy buff, you say it's white liberals and 3 days later you're dead. Is there a connection? And then you have what? The FBI under Democratic Party come to investigate and say, oh, nothing to find here. Some things never change, do they? Okay. Note also now with all of this reasoning, this is also now getting placed on Christianity, with blaming Christian bigotry as blame for other societal problems that happen to the LGBTQ plus community. So again, whether you've done anything, as long as you are this, you're guilty. Whether you know anybody, have said anything to anybody, whether you've done anything to anybody, it doesn't matter. If you are a conservative Christian, you are guilty of oppressing these people. And then you can't come and say, well, look how dangerous those lifestyles are. When you look at the age that gay men die, and you say that's a dangerous lifestyle. See, if it wasn't for sexual issues like that, a lot of the gay men would live much longer. But disease gets transmitted, all these awful things happen. And then tied to this is substance abuse. We just saw that in the Jesse Smollett thing. Well, what was he doing with the two Nigerians? Coke and dope, or coke and pot. That's because oftentimes there's a lot of drug abuse tied into this. And so is it better to leave people in a situation where they're going to die young, or is it better to say there's a better way and preach them the gospel and point them to Jesus Christ? But again, the same reasoning that we just saw for all that whiteness is now getting applied to Christians on now what they would call the sexual minorities. And so now you see churches and pastors giving into that too. Because they want to be the nice pastor. They want people to slap them on the back. They want to be the good guy against all them awful biblical Christians, them people. And so all the things they accuse us of are the things that they're actually up to. Okay, just some questions. So why is it claimed that being born white gives someone white privilege and makes them guilty of oppression?
They have good.
Yeah. Part of it. Yeah. They have it too good. They have it easy. Or they think they do.
The other side thinks they
Yeah.
do.
Yeah. But it's always easy to find other people that looks like they have the easy road, right? And that happens amongst every other group also, within the groups. You know, one of the great sins of humanity is jealousy. Is that not what drives this? Jealousy and covetousness? I want what you have and I'm going to take it, which then leads them to theft. But again, it's not based on anything solid. This is just all Marxism repackaged. Because you need an enemy.
And could you add maybe sloth to that?
Sloth, yeah.
You're not willing to work for something, so because you don't have it, you're just going to blame them
Yep.
for why you don't have what you.
Yep. It's the easy way, right? And again, this all promotes victimhood. And if you're going to be a victim, you need the victimizer. And so they make just a whole group victimizers, whether anybody in the group actually has done anything or not. All of it's unbiblical. And then why must white privilege simply be assumed by those who claim its existence?
Logically, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense. Show us the facts. Let us reason together. But once you've come to your conclusion, before you've started the discussion, there's no discussion to be had. And then if they say, well, we want to dialogue over that, they don't want you to dialogue over it. They simply want, at the end of the talk, for you to accept what they said. They want you to give up your beliefs and they want to hold on to theirs. That's what dialogue in the world and dialogue in a lot of the church is right now. Well, let's just discuss these issues. That's right, as we pointed out, most of those discussions in the church should end because thus saith the Lord. You don't need a discussion after thus saith the Lord.
But they don't want that.
They don't want that. It doesn't suit their purposes. So what might be other explanations besides race that can give members of the dominant culture groups anywhere advantages over others? Does it help speak Chinese in China? Or Japanese in Japan? Or Arabic in Saudi Arabia? Culture. And in every culture, there's a bit of it's who you know, right? Sort of like Washington, D.C. It's not what you do, it's all who you know. And that's all a part of this. So there's lots of other explanations, lots of other things in culture. And so should you tear down the dominant culture wherever it is and just say we have to get rid of it all? It used to be in the U.S. where you assimilated into the culture. Do you know all the Germans when they came over spoke German? And I believe all their descendants, or most of their descendants, now speak English, or at least know it. Most of the Dutch, when they came over, they only spoke Dutch. They learned the English, and now you can find a few people who still speak Dutch, but they assimilated. English was the dominant language. That's what needed to be learned. That if you're going to operate, you're going to grow in those communities. That's what had to do. And so instead of tearing it down, there's some assimilation that has to happen. But now we have had the idea, well, you just have to hold on to whatever you want to hold on to, and you don't have to assimilate. Everybody else has to bend to you. Well, eventually it leads to chaos and destruction, and that's the path our country's on right now. And so how do whites who claim having what they have because of white privilege deny God's providential care and blessings?
They're putting it on the color of their skin and not what God has done.
Yeah. Well, and it's also saying, well, you only have what you have because you oppressed some minority. Well, I believe we have what we have because God's blessed us.
So one is they're saying you need to admit that this is sin, but God, instead, in reality, it's a blessing. So
Yep.
they want you to say what is a blessing.
Yep. Yeah, and that's why it's really an attack on God. And so this is an insult for white Christians to do this. It's an insult to God. To say what they have, what God has given to them, is somehow built upon the oppression of somebody else. You know, and you can find the oppression, but oftentimes it's the white liberal with his Apple telephone from China. It's the white liberal with his Nike shoes from China, all built on slave labor, or much of it built on slave labor. So there is maybe white privilege for them, even though those who have those Apple phones come in all colors. But they're all taking advantage of somebody's slavery. And so, is that white privilege or liberal privilege? That's probably a better thing.
What really scares me with that, with calling what is a blessing privilege and then lamenting it and trying to repent of it, just reminds me of Israel being released, being saved from Egypt, and then right away, instead of being grateful, they complain.
And said we had we're better off in Egypt.
Yeah, I mean, whenever we're ungrateful to God, that's when.
Yeah, and so I wouldn't, I wouldn't think the judgment's that far off for our land. Jesus may not come for everybody yet, but at some point God's judgment falls on individual nations also. And so we have to be aware of it. Because, again, it's ungrateful. That's one of the key sins in Romans 1. There was no thank you to God. There was no gratitude. And again, if you've said, well, what I have is because of what other people have, then just give it all away. Don't come complaining to me. Don't do anything. You just give everything away. You inherited a little land, sign it off to a Native American. Say, I'm giving it back to you. Just keep enough to have a couple plane tickets for you and your family to fly back to Europe and have at it. Easy enough. You want to solve your guilt? That's dealing with your guilt. But don't tell me I'm guilty for what you've done. So if that's the road they want, then make them live it out. Press them on it. You can do it. Sign it off. God will take care of you on the other side. Trust Him. And He might. It'd sure be a wake-up call to Him. Go to Sioux Falls, take the keys to your vehicles, sign off your vehicles to the closest homeless person. You not only give them a car, you give them a place to stay.
I've seen this in some of the, leftist church, people that, white privilege is that golden calf. It's that sin. And if they want to use those Christian words, then they need to take that example of what God said to do with your idols. Don't leave a little bit.
Get rid of it all.
100%.
Yep, just enough for them plane tickets back to Europe. That's all they need. Give it away. If they're going to press the point, if they really believe this, then they better follow through. If they don't really believe it, if they're not going to follow through, then they just need to shut up. Because I don't want to hear the nonsense. It's not worth my time. Okay, how is social justice redefined white supremacy, and how does that impact white people? So there again, it was tied to things you did, right? Were you a Nazi? Are you a skinhead with a swastika tattooed to the side of your head or on your neck or something like that? Your guy walks around with a white hood in the middle of the night with a torch of some sort? Because that's what we all thought it was. But now it's the little old lady who's walking across the street with her cane, who's white. It's the mom pushing her child down the street or down the sidewalk with her in a stroller. She's the white supremacist.
So I like to play along with this in the same way that they're trying to dupe people that just aren't aware of what's going on. I like to play that dupe person too, to their comments. So when they say, I had to deal with my white supremacy, then I kind of play stupid. And I think it's fun to be like, so how long were you in the KKK? And how long when did you burn your white hood? And it's just kind of.
I use it for pillowcase now. But again, it's not. They simply redefine it and you're guilty no matter what. So again, play the games on them, mess with their minds. And so if it's a liberal white person, then you ask them what they did. Can I see your tattoo of a swastika? You know, I knew some white supremacists at the prison. They had swastikas on their arms and on their necks. I'm pretty sure I knew one guy who had one on the side of his head. They do exist. So if your liberal friends want to say, well, you know, this is me too, I say, well, show me the tats. It's easy enough. Prove your point. And if you can't prove your point, then don't fall for the lie. And don't profess the lie. So how are charges of Christian nationalism now being used to undermine the very things that help form a healthy society? They say they're idols. And the worst thing, again, is the ones who have heard this with are evangelical preachers. Oh, yeah, those are your idols. All of a sudden now, if you care about your family, oh, your family's your idol. If you worked hard and earned a good living, oh, well, now that's your idol. Well, no, that's called living for God. Raising a conscientious, good, solid family is something we're called to. And then to turn and say that that's an idol is insanity. And I personally think that Christian leaders who do that are sinning. Because they're proclaiming a lie. They know it's a lie, and it's only to make themselves feel good.
They're actually blaspheming.
Yeah. It's just awful all the way through. And as a conservative, you got to challenge people for those things. Don't let them get away with it. And so how should a white Christian respond to the accusation of racism when they personally have not done anything? Walk away. Say, your reality is your reality, mine's mine. I don't have to own this. See, part of what they do is everything's relativistic. It's all subjective. So you say, you have that reality. I have a different reality. You know, half of those guys nowadays have their reality is they can be Superman or some other Marvel hero or something. Well, they live in a whole different, they're detached from reality. But we don't have to buy into their nonsense. And we shouldn't. Again, walk away. So why are reason and logic now being rejected as ways to best address the many claims of whiteness, white fragility, etc.?
Because it would show their stupidity.
It does. Shows there's no logic, there's no reason, there's no facts. And again, have there been awful things that have happened to black people? Yes. Have there been awful things that have happened to Native Americans? Yes. Have there been awful things that have happened to white people? Yes. Go down the whole color scheme. Whatever you want to see them at. Everybody's faced this. You know, should Egypt be giving reparations to Israel yet? Oh, that's right. They paid reparations when they left, right? They gave them all their money. Get rid of you. But so you have to just sort of see those things. If you can't do reason and logic, there's no discussion. You're simply wasting your time at that point. Say, you come off of Pluto and we'll have a discussion. Until then, I'm not wasting my time with you. And it's better for your heart, your blood pressure and stuff anyway. And so now, how would a conservative Christian be guilty of oppressing people sexually?
By living God's standards.
That's one way, yeah. But if you believe in the Bible, then all of those principles that they use against whites also apply for Christianity. And that's really where the attack is. It's not simply white people, because there's lots of white liberals. This is against white conservatives, white Christians. That's really what they want to overthrow, because we're the most formidable group that stands in their way of this idiocy. And if they can overcome us, then they can do whatever they want. because the moderates are already mush. Just look at the churches. Yeah, we'll let anything in. Just don't make me have to take a stand. They've already caved.
But like you said, the white Christian is a minority, really.
Yeah, we covered that in one of the early lessons. You start divvying it up. What are we? Maybe 12%? That's not a majority of anything, is it? So the idea that we're this majority controlling the whole world is idiotic. And if they really want to fix people, let them start with the white liberals. Leave me alone until you fix those guys. Take their stuff first. They have more stuff than I do. In general, statistics show that the white liberals are richer than white conservatives. In part because white conservatives give so much away to other good causes. To their churches, to all, just look at all the mission stuff that we fund. And the ones we're looking at adding this next year. Helping the unwed moms. We're offerings for the mission. For the prison aftercare. I'm pretty sure there aren't very many atheists that send money to those. Just saying. There weren't too many atheist groups that came with Diana and I into the prison to counsel and help and encourage and try to help these guys overcome.
He did meet a Wiccan chaplain.
Yeah, from Rapid City,
You
but
could feel it.
yeah, he was unusual. So anyway, that's kind of the end. So I hope that sort of settles things out again. It's crazy, and we sort of have to understand the craziness of it, and don't become part of the craziness.